With the outbreak of war in 1939, the national broadcaster would become, at least in theory, subject to the same censorship restrictions as the newspapers. The obvious distinction was that the newspapers were outside the state, whereas the broadcaster was run directly as a part of the Department of Posts and Telegraphs. So the manner in which censorship worked, at least in its early period, was not exactly the same. Um, and this actually led to some inconsistencies in the early months of the war, whereby the broadcaster actually broadcast news and information that would have been banned had it been submitted by the newspapers for censorship. The practice that is eventually set on or ended up with is that the any news bulletins that the broadcaster was going to put out would actually be read to Frank Gallagher as one of the figures who was in charge of censorship during the war. Um, the war is not a fantastic time in terms of listenership for 2RN for pragmatic reasons. Because Ireland is neutral, it's effectively cut off from basically the rest of Europe and America. It's very difficult to get access to some basic supplies, and that includes the kind of supplies that were necessary for radio, that is, for having a radio set in your home, both for buying new sets but also for maintaining existing ones. So if your radio set broke, your domestic set broke during the Second World War in Ireland, it was hard to get replacement parts. Batteries, something that simple, were actually difficult to get access to. And so actually you see a decline in the number of licenses basically held in Ireland for the first time since the establishment of 2RN in 1926. Now that's a temporary decline, it's just for the war, it will pick up thereafter. Nonetheless, that the difficulty in getting access to that kind of basic equipment illustrated the kind of isolation that Ireland experienced during the war, and that isolation is not just at the level of getting access to basic materials. It's also, I suppose, a kind of a political isolation because we identify ourselves and we pursue a policy of political neutrality. And this would in turn lead to a revival of an idea which had been at least considered since the 1920s and actively experimented with in the late 1930s. And this was the establishment of a shortwave transmission infrastructure for the national broadcaster. And the advantage of shortwave was that you could transmit over much greater distances, i.e. not just across the country, but potentially across the Atlantic to the United States and across Europe, which would have basically allowed the national broadcaster to become an international voice for Ireland. And there was already in the pre-war period, like late 1930s, an awareness that Ireland wasn't really succeeding in kind of communicating its story directly to the world. And so there was some experimentation with the establishment of shortwave transmission technology. However, it was of limited success. And during the war in particular, it was so difficult to get access to the basic raw materials needed to build that kind of transmitter that they essentially shelved the idea for that period. But the implications of not being able to communicate beyond our national borders became kind of manifest by the end of the war, and it's exemplified by a broadcast and a response to a broadcast that Winston Churchill makes. Basically, Churchill used the BBC to broadcast, not quite to the globe, but to America and to Europe, celebrating the defeat of Germany. And in the course of that broadcast, he criticised the Irish government for having adopted a neutral stance during the Second World War, pointed out that the defeat of Germany had been done without the aid of the Irish, and at one point makes a reference to how tolerant essentially Britain had been of Irish neutrality, saying that it would have been legitimate for Britain to have invaded Ireland as a way of defending its western flank during the Second World War. Now, obviously this is politically outrageous. It was precisely the fact that Germany had invaded Poland in 1939 that had prompted, and it was the short term, if you like, prompt for the war in the first place. Within a few days, Eamon de Valera, who's Taoiseach at the time, seeks to rebut to make a rebuttal to Churchill's comments, and they revived within Ireland the experimental shortwave infrastructure that they had, so that that signal could be transmitted outside Ireland.
Certain newspapers have been very persistent in looking for my answer to Mr. Churchill's recent broadcast. I know the kind of answer I am expected to make. I know the answer that first springs to the lips of every man of Irish blood who heard or read that speech, no matter in what circumstances or in what part of the world he found himself. I know the reply I would have given a quarter of a century ago. But I have deliberately decided that this is not the reply I shall make tonight. I shall strive not to be guilty of adding any fuel to the flames of hatred and passion, which, if continue to be fed, promise to burn up whatever is left by the war of decent human feeling in Europe.
For the most part, it was only heard within Ireland, and so it was very much kind of preaching to the converted. But this was one of the factors, I think, that revived an interest in the idea of a shortwave station in the immediate post-war period. So in 1945, there is a huge investment in the building of a shortwave transmitter somewhere outside Athlone. It's the way shortwave works takes a lot of space, so it's a 40-acre site is built for shortwave transmissions. And at this point, there was a kind of recognition that if Ireland was going to present its face to the world through radio, that they would have to address the poverty of the service as it had been in the pre-war period, the lack of funds that had been made available to it. And so in April 1946, P.J. Little, who is the Minister for Posts and Telegraphs, announces a huge investment in, I guess what you call it, kind of production capacity within the national broadcaster. So the existing orchestra is significantly enlarged, and it is augmented by a second orchestra, basically a light orchestra. New journalists are taken on to allow the broadcaster to enhance its news gathering service and its news production service. You have investment in mobile recording units, so that it was no longer the case. It would no longer be the case that if you wanted to be heard on the radio, that you had to go up to Dublin or to the Cork station. Now, mobile recording units could travel the country, recording voices, songs, basic communications from just about anywhere around Ireland. You had a repertory company, a theatre company established for the first time. So all in all, there's a huge investment basically in the ability to actually make programming. Now, there's a kind of an irony here. In 1948, there's an election which sees the Fianna Fáil government, which had been in Paris in 1932, and which had initially introduced the shortwave project, thrown out of power and replaced by a coalition led by Fine Gael. And this new coalition government looked at the shortwave station as a kind of a vanity project of the previous Taoiseach, of Eamon de Valera's. So they decide to basically mothball the whole thing. But what they don't, and what they suppose cannot do, is withdraw all the production resources that have been granted to the broadcaster. So even though the shortwave project basically stops dead in 1948, the production resources, the enhanced production resources, which had been granted to the broadcaster in anticipation of the shortwave station, were left in situ. So you've got a much better resourced radio station by the end of the 1940s. The start of the 1950s sees the beginning, too, of a change in the nature of the relationship between the broadcaster and between the state. In 1944, P.J. Little, as Minister of Posts and Telegraphs, had revived the Broadcasting Advisory Committee, provision for which had been made in 1926 Wireless Telegraphy Act, but which had been barely used up to that period. And the committee which Little puts in place lasts for a good decade, so it's got kind of it's consistently there for the first time in the history of the broadcaster. And that in itself is significant because it meant that there was some kind of external advice going to the minister on what broadcasting should do, how it should be organised. In 1950, the Broadcasting Advisory Committee had published a report suggesting to the minister that it was time to basically take broadcasting out of the day-to-day responsibility of the Department of Posts and Telegraphs. Now, that idea was not immediately accepted. In fact, it was rejected in 1950. But that idea gradually begins to take hold over the course of the 1950s. A key figure here is Erskine Childers, a modernising Minister for Posts and Telegraphs who was appointed after Fianna Fáil came back into power in 1951. Childers introduces a complete innovation to the organisation of broadcasting, and this is the creation of what he refers to as the Comhairle, or a council. This was 5 people who were to advise him and to assist him on the general control and supervision of the service that at this stage is now formally known as Radio Éireann. The establishment of the Comhairle, although in theory direct control of broadcasting remained with the minister, does lead to some transition in the relationship between state and broadcaster. Department of Post and Telegraph staff are literally transferred or transposed from being civil servants to working under the Comhairle. And one of the crucial impacts of this is that the radio station, Radio Éireann, now had much greater sort of clarity and autonomy over its finances than had been the case under the previous regime, whereby any kind of expenditure was subject to the direct control of the Department of Finance. Childers brought other changes. Childers was very much seen as a man who is kind of sympathetic with the operation of commerce, industry and commerce in general. As even before he came in, there had been something of a relaxation in 1949 of rules on advertising, and advertising had begun to occupy a greater proportion of airtime on RTE. But from 1951 onwards, from 1952 onwards, Childers changed the rule whereby only Irish manufactured products could be advertised on RTE. From that point onwards, he allowed Irish companies who were importing goods to begin advertising their products on not RTE but on Radio Éireann at that point. The other really significant innovation brought about by Childers was a transformation of political broadcasting, which essentially had been absent on Irish radio up to that point. For the first time under Childers, unscripted political discussion is permitted on the national broadcaster. There had up to this point been a ban on TDs appearing basically in broadcast. This is removed. And in the run-up to the 1954 general election, for the first time you have party political broadcasts. So there's the beginnings of a kind of a political dimension to radio content in Ireland for the very first time since the establishment of 2RN in 1926. But there were also changes coming to broadcasting from outside. Radio Éireann was already facing external competition from the BBC, most obviously I suppose, but also from radio stations as far away as Luxembourg, in the case of Radio Luxembourg. But by the start of the 1950s, it was evident that a new form of broadcasting, television, was going to also constitute some kind of competition for Radio Éireann. In 1950, the Secretary of the Department of Posts and Telegraphs, so a civil servant, but the senior civil servant within the department, Leon O'Brien, began what would turn out to be a 10-year battle to basically get the idea of television taken seriously. As early as 1953, if you lived in the east coast of Ireland, so you lived in Dublin, Wicklow, Louth, Meath to a certain extent, it would have been possible to have picked up BBC television broadcasts coming from over the Irish Sea, from Wales and from Yorkshire. In 1953, the BBC opened a BBC television transmitter in Belfast, so you had a further encroachment of signals. And it was this in particular, I suppose, that incentivised Leon O'Brien to begin to explore the question of introducing television. Even if, as it turned out, initially at least, Erskine Childers didn't particularly warm to the idea, believing that it would basically kill the art of conversation. Nonetheless, television was clearly coming, and the 1950s would see the Department of Posts and Telegraphs engage in a series of internal debates over what might be the best way to organise it.